Welcome to Inside Medical Malpractice. My name is Chris Rokosh. I'm a registered nurse, legal consultant and educator, and the president of Connect Medical Legal Experts. Each month, we'll be looking at malpractice issues from different perspectives, featuring honest, candid, insightful interviews by people and professionals with a wealth of information to share. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now let's dive into this fascinating subject. Welcome to the first of two best of the best episodes of Inside Medical Malpractice. At the end of almost every episode that we've recorded over the past 2 years, I've asked each of our guests to share the most important thing they'd like healthcare providers, lawyers, and the general public to know about malpractice. As you know, our guests have included doctors, nurses, a dentist, plaintiff lawyers, physician and hospital defense lawyers, and a Supreme Court judge. Their answers have been as different as their perspectives, but always valuable, insightful, and thought-provoking. So we've put together what we thought were the best pieces of advice they had to offer in two fascinating episodes. The first will be this month, and the second will be released 1 month from today. So have a listen. I promise you'll learn something, and I hope that you're really going to love this episode. First up, plaintiff's lawyer Brian Devlin from Calgary, Alberta, offers his thoughts on malpractice as a 40-year veteran lawyer. His advice is outstanding. For the public, it includes, just because something bad happened to you in a hospital doesn't mean it was anyone's fault. And for lawyers, don't ever get your client involved in a malpractice lawsuit unless you have a good expert to back you up. Words of wisdom from someone who knows and has seen a lot of life and law. Here's the question that I'd like you to answer for 3 different audiences. What's the most important thing that you would like healthcare providers, doctors and nurses specifically, to know about medical malpractice?
Well, again, speaking strictly for myself, they should know that I don't launch these actions cavalierly. In other words, I know how difficult it is for one of these, especially these young doctors, to get sued. I mean, I can imagine it's just probably the worst stress they've had in their whole career. You suddenly get through med school, you're on your way in your career, and then bang, something happens, and you've got a lawsuit hanging over your head, and it's going to be there for 5 or 6 years. So, speaking strictly for myself, I mean, I try to make sure that I've got a good reason to be suing somebody before I ever do it. So it's not done lightly, and it's not done without some, serious investigation beforehand. So, I'm not saying that all lawyers do that, and sometimes people come in at the last minute. The limitation is going to run out tomorrow, and you have to file. But that still gives you another year. But, they should know that that at least, I think all the senior guys doing this, they're not doing it on a whim. They're doing it based on what happened and based on understanding of the facts and the medicine and the expert opinions involved. So no one is doing it just to try and get a quick settlement. No one should be thinking that they're going to sue some doctor and it's like a rear-ender motor vehicle collision where you write one letter to the insurance company and send you a check for a couple $1 million. That does not happen ever. So, I would just want them to know that it's something we take lightly, and that it's there's some considerable effort that goes into it before that ever comes to pass.
How about answer that same question? What is the most important thing that you'd like other lawyers to know, and maybe the upstarts or people who are thinking about moving their practice into malpractice? What would you like them to know about a medical malpractice practice?
Well, I probably already covered it, but, it's not something to jump into lightly. It's something that you have to, as a lawyer, you have to look at it in terms of, can I do this? Can I afford to do it? Can I really represent these people properly? And if not, if you come to the conclusion that you can't, then you shouldn't take the case, or you should at least maybe partner up with somebody who has some more experience or whatever. But getting into doing a malpractice case, it's not, if you've done a bunch of personal injury work, it's not that different. The damages part of it are not different at all. It's the liability and understanding the medicine and what you have to do, what experts are appropriate for the circumstances. And you can find that stuff out. It's not impossible by any means, but it's not going to be easy. And so if you're a guy who's got a good personal injury practice going and you're used to settling with insurance companies and you've never done a trial or one trial in your life, the chances of you taking on a big malpractice case, it's not a good idea without some further experience. And that's all I would say is be careful about it and try to if you do it, do the work up front, do the investigation, get an expert, and don't ever launch a statement of claim and get your client involved in one of these things without knowing that you at least have a decent expert to back you up and a good chance of either settling or winning. Because if you do, you're in for a long road.
That sounds like some damn fine advice right there. How about answer that same question now for the public, the general public? What is the most important thing you'd like them to know about medical malpractice?
Well, I guess the most important thing is that just because something happened in the hospital or a doctor was involved and someone suffered an injury or a death does not mean that the medical profession or the hospital are responsible. It's not, I was injured while I was in the hospital or I had a bad result, therefore they're at fault. They're only at fault if you can show that they were actually negligent and did something that was, it has to be something pretty serious, a serious breach of duty before you get to the point where you have a legitimate claim. And the other thing is if it's not, substantial, like I have people call me all the time over, somebody goes in to see a dentist, for example, and they have a sore in their mouth for 2 weeks or something. Minor injuries and so on are just not worth what it's going to take. So if you talk to a lawyer, chances are they're going to tell you that, and it's not going to be, unless you should have a serious case and a serious reason to think somebody did something wrong. And if you do, that's fine, get a lawyer and look into it and they'll investigate it. But don't assume that just because you had a bad result from a medical person or in the hospital that it's their fault. And I see that all the time. Somebody will say, well, I went in there for this and my surgery didn't work out very well, or my knee replacement didn't work out. Well, medicine's not a strict black and white science. It's more of an art. And so these things can happen. These things can happen without anybody being at fault. People die every day and get injured in hospitals, and it's not necessarily anybody's fault. But if you think it is, then, you should have it investigated.
Next up, Dr. Laura Fortner, an Ohio OBGYN who shared her story of surviving an obstetrical lawsuit by getting help, becoming a life coach, and now helping other physicians through the process, offers some great insight into the experience of a physician being sued. One thought that struck with me from this episode was her comment that litigation stress is real. There's also a bonus section here with Dr. Laura's excellent advice for healthcare providers on how not to get sued.
In your view, what is the most important thing that healthcare providers need to know about medical malpractice?
I think the most important thing is be open to exploring ways to get help for yourself and not think that, you can just get over it. Like, just be open to that knowledge. I think this is the biggest thing. If you got anything out of today, is to go get support, go get help right away, so that you weren't like me 6-7 years later, still dealing with litigation stress and not knowing how to overcome it.
Great advice there. What about lawyers? What is the most important thing you'd like lawyers and attorneys to know about medical malpractice from your perspective?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think handling physicians with a notion of a little bit of compassion because of we take this a little more personally than most other professionals out there, and to identify and know that litigation stress is real, and to help them right away, and maybe point them in a direction to where you should get support. Like, your spouse may not be enough. This is really important, and I do know that those, like, I am way better now than I was way back then. And if I would have been this way when I got deposed in my deposition, I think I would have been much better, overall.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. The whole process would have gone a little bit differently. Understood. And what would you like the public to know about malpractice?
I think the thing about public is I'd like you to look at both perspectives and both lenses, both viewpoints, because there's two stories here. And while I believe there are things that need compensated for, and patients do have valid complaints, and I'm not dismissing any of that, I want you to look through both lenses, because there's the other side to it too. And I think when we both look at each other as human beings that are doing the best we can on this earth at the time that we've been given, with the knowledge we've been given, maybe some of these cases wouldn't go so far, and maybe mediation would be better served and an option, and which doesn't really happen in this world right now. So it's just something to think about.
Well,
yeah.
I'm sure that now that you've gone through this experience, you must have some advice to offer on how to not get sued. Could you share that with us?
Yeah. So I love to kind of share how to avoid litigation with people. And I use the word avoid as like an acronym, because I think that it's fairly powerful to kind of remember these are things. We brought up some of these things, but the first A in avoid is attitude, and really having a really good attitude and not an uncaring attitude. I think when communication is everything. And so the first two letters of avoid have to deal with communication, because honestly, that's the most reason why patients sue, is that they feel that they were not heard. They felt that you were not compassionate. They felt that you were in a rush and you didn't see them, right? Or hear them or know them. And building that relationship with the patient is so crucial, and the communication is so crucial. So your attitude has to be one of a caring provider, that you are hearing them. And what I like to do, so this is the V, which is value the patient's perspective. I like to go into a room trying to sit in the patient's shoes, especially if, say, something happened, like a complication happened, and an outcome happened that was unexpected, right? Or she had just had a miscarriage, right? And before I go into the room, I really like to sit and think, what is her perspective right now? What is she going through? And I walk in very compassionate and empathetic towards her perspective. And that goes so far, and even sitting there for a few more minutes, smiling, a handshake, those type of gestures, people see you as a human being, and they value you. When you're in a rush, when you're looking at your computer screen and don't look up because we're now all in EMR, and, those things don't go well with people. And so it's just the little things that can add so much to the relationship. And I think communication obviously is key. That's the number one thing I think we could all do and learn from and get better at. The O is operate in systems. And what do I mean by that? Is having a system for everything in your office. The way that you do it is always the way you do it. And what I mean is, like, if you're answering a phone call, the nurses are answering phone calls, right? How are you documenting that? Is it the same way every time? Is it, are the messages getting to the physician? Like, what is your system in place that is streamlined? Because here's the thing, mess. And if patients feel like your organization is messy or your office is messy, equals lawsuit. I mean, it's just more fuel to the fire that they're upset with you, that something can happen. So operating with systems that are consistent, that are, that you have in place with everything. And I mean, down to details of surgical, even like when you're scheduling surgeries, or your, any of those pathways that you do in your office, you want to have a system. And then I is initiate self-care. So this is so important, because physicians are workaholics. Many of them, we work a lot more than, a lot of times we don't say no. And initiating your own self-care, having a day where you're off, you're spending time with family, you're learning how to be present, you're not on your phone, you're not answering calls. Like, this is so important. What it gets it for you in terms of your self-care. How can you cater to yourself so that you become more self-compassionate? If you're taking care of yourself, you're going to be able to take care of your patients so much better. And the D is document cleanly. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're taking phone calls, one phone call you document, and then the other one you don't, and you don't have a template. Like, you just really want to keep it cohesive and very consistent, and documentation is really key. And now with EMR, yes, we have, I think maybe more, all-inclusive documentation, but at the same time, I'll make sure that you're reading it and that it's not just a template, and you're actually making medical decision-making, and you're writing out your medical decision-making in a way that if there's multiple diagnoses that you're thinking about, like, just write it all down in your thought process. Like, so I think that's a major key when it comes to litigation and trial, is your documentation is a big deal.
Now, Gary Will, a plaintiff's lawyer from Toronto, offers his learnings from litigating one of the largest COVID-19 class actions in the Canadian long-term care centers. One memorable thought for lawyers listening in who might be thinking about getting involved in this class action: he says, it's a tremendous fight that we're involved in. We need all hands on deck. These people are very deserving of our attention.
So I think the biggest lesson for members of the healthcare community is that if you see a problem, you need to act on it and you need to report it. Now, the first level that you report it to is your employer, so your immediate supervisor. And if you're seeing a problem with the level of care being provided in the long-term care facility, you report it to your supervisor. If you don't get the proper answers, then you go to the higher level of authority. And if you don't get an answer, then there's avenues. You can report it to the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. And there is a process for investigating those complaints. And I think you owe it to the residents of long-term care facilities, because they often can't speak for themselves. And many of them have severe problems, and you can't rely on the family to always speak on behalf of the residents. So I think the real advocates for residents of long-term care facilities are the staff and the nurses and the PSWs. And you really have a duty to come forward and take corrective measures when things are not being properly looked after. We've received a lot of calls from nurses and PSWs who are now reporting on what was occurring, and this is very helpful information for our lawsuit. And I think what might have been very valuable were maybe some of these complaints, if made at an earlier stage, could have been investigated and corrected before we had this major disaster. So I think that is the biggest lesson, is that if you're seeing a problem, report it immediately. You owe it to the people that you're looking after.
Thank you. Good advice there. What about for the general public? What can the families and the public and those of us that are eventually facing the potential of long-term care ourselves, what can we learn from this action?
So I think for the general public, this whole affair has been a great awakening. I think it quite legitimately, for a lot of people, wouldn't have had any information of what was occurring in our long-term care homes. And I speak from my own personal observations. I don't know anybody in a long-term care facility right now, unfortunately. And so I certainly was not aware of what was occurring. But now, as a result of all the investigating that I've done, I've got a good level of knowledge. And I think as a result of a lot of the publicity that has been focused on this issue, now the general public knows about this issue. And I think the real message is we can't forget about this. You know, we've got to do something about it, Everyone knows now, the politicians know, the media knows, the public knows. Let's really do something about it, fix it as a problem, so it's fixed for the benefit of everyone that's going to need those services in the future.
Also great advice, because often after a crisis like this has passed, it's just out of sight and out of mind, right? And the recommendations, the actions, and the fervor around making change disappears. So I think that's really great advice for the public. We also have a lot of lawyers listening in. Do you have any comments or lessons or learnings for them surrounding this action and the COVID-19 outbreak?
Yeah, so I'm going to address it mainly to plaintiffs' lawyers out there. There are many that may never have taken a case against a long-term care facility. I think the lesson for those lawyers is that it is a tremendous fight that we're involved in. We need all hands on deck. If you've never done a case before, maybe you should consider joining the fight, because these people are very deserving of our attention. It's our parents and our grandparents who've given so much to this country, and now at a point where they're extremely vulnerable and need our help. We as a legal profession, we should step up to the plate and make sure that these people are looked after. I do consider that this is the most significant piece of litigation that I've been involved in my 36 years of practice, and I intend to take this fight forward and make sure that there's something positive that happens as a result of all this. But there are many deserving individuals out there, and my message to other lawyers is join the battle for these very deserving individuals, and let's get justice for these people.
Now here's Nashville plaintiff's attorney Randy Kennard's advice on malpractice for healthcare professionals, lawyers, and patients. His words, "Malpractice is real," have stuck with me since we first recorded this episode, but he has lots more to say than that, so have a listen. For the attorneys listening in, what is the most important thing that you'd like them to know about medical malpractice?
Well, it's real. When I first started practicing law, I held doctors, nurses, and anybody in the health care community on a pedestal. I think it was part of my background to always do that. And I still do. And even if a provider has made a mistake in one case, that doesn't mean I don't hold that person on a pedestal, but I still do. When I see my doctor, he's on a pedestal. And when a nurse comes in, she's on a pedestal. But I learned early in my law career, when a case was referred to me and somebody asked me to represent a federal prisoner in a medical malpractice claim against the government, I said, I don't do that. And they said, well, would you at least go talk to the man? So I went out to the prison and talked to him, and he told me what happened. And he said he needed a hemorrhoidectomy, and the government doctor who did the surgery had a condition that the man later found out was Huntington's chorea, causing him to shake a lot, and that he cut his anus really badly during this procedure. And then he had no bowel control and had to wear diapers the rest of his life.
Oh, boy.
I went, my goodness. And so I said, well, I'll take your case. And I took that doctor's deposition, and his hands were shaking. It wasn't just from being nervous about the deposition. And I said, do you have Huntington's chorea? He said, yes. I said, how long have you had it? And he told me several years. And so I thought, you just should not be doing that type surgery anymore. And that showed me that that interview with that client caused me to go forward, and malpractice is real. I learned that. So it does exist, and in cases where there has been malpractice, the patient is entitled to a recovery, a fair and just recovery. And if the case can't be settled by the medical care provider and the insurance company, then they should go forward, have no fear, and go in there and represent the patient. If the medical care provider has done something wrong, consider allowing the insurance company to pay the patient. So does that answer your question, Chris?
It does answer my question. The specific question was, what do you want attorneys to know about malpractice? And your answer was, it's real. It's real.
So it's real, and but this is a tough area to get into. It takes some tenacity and ability to fight hard and to stand up when you lose. You know, you get knocked down. You'll get knocked down in this business on either side. You have to get back up and get in there. And so,
what's the most important thing you'd like the public to know about medical malpractice? My mom just broke a hip and had surgery a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, I didn't leave her side for several days. I was there all day, every day, just, you know, keeping an eye on things from my nursing perspective. But you as a malpractice attorney, what do you want the public to know about malpractice?
Well, Chris, you hit it right on the head. If a loved one or you or somebody is going into the hospital, have somebody with you trust to sit there and keep an eye on things and ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. So if you're in the hospital, have somebody with you, if you can, that you trust to help. Just keep an eye on things and who can help you.
Yeah.
If you're going to the doctor's office, this is particularly true for people who are moving on in age a little bit. It's good to have a spouse with you, or and in the case of my elderly father a few years ago, before he passed, I went to a general surgeon's office. So, because he had an abdominal aorta aneurysm. And I know we're going to discuss the pros and cons of possible surgery. And I also knew my father is not likely to remember much of this or understand it. And I'm going to go and listen. And if it's appropriate, I'm going to say something. So the surgeon explains, at the time, this was the morbidity from this was big, you know, can be, mortality was significant.
Yeah, that's serious stuff.
And he said to my father, if you don't do this surgery, what will happen in about 5 years or so, this is going to burst and you're going to bleed to death. It'll take a few minutes and you'll die. If you do have the surgery, you may wish you were dead, you know. And my father just had this perplexed look on his face, and he said, Randy, what should I do? Talk about burden, right?
Really?
Said,
yes.
Don't do the surgery, Dad. He said, okay. And indeed, he died 3 years later of another problem, and that decision was right, but there's no telling what he would have decided if I hadn't been there. You know, he the type of guy who'd always listen to the doctor. And if that doctor had said, I want to do the surgery, he probably would have gone along with it. And then who knows what would have happened. But so it's good to have somebody with you is the main thing.
When I spoke with John Hall, a physician defense lawyer from Atlanta, Georgia, I was struck by his straightforward, no-nonsense guidance for all of us on how to be a good patient. Listen in as he tells us all his view on the best way of avoiding ever getting involved in a medical malpractice case. It's great advice. In your view, what is the most important thing you'd like them to know about medical malpractice? And let's start with healthcare professionals first, because that seems to be your jam.
I think the most important thing for them is to understand that what you're doing is a great service, that you're doing it to get a great outcome and not to allow the system to stop you from doing what you spent all those years of training and education to doing, going out and help people. Don't be afraid of the legal system. There's people out there to help you get through it. Focus on giving great medical care, which is why you became a healthcare provider.
That's a great piece of advice. I felt that one right in my heart. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. What about to the attorneys out there? What's the most important thing you'd like them to know about malpractice? And let's talk to both plaintiff and defense.
Sure. I think the key is our system should not be about entrepreneurial financial gain either way. It shouldn't be denying. I'm fortunate to represent most of my clients want to do the right thing. If they did something wrong, they're willing to look into that, face it, and give reasonable value on those cases. And I find most plaintiffs' lawyers ultimately will work with you and try to find that. But we have to prevent the exceptions in the system that are driving up these things beyond what's reasonable. Because if we don't, we're going to kill the whole system, which is going to hurt both plaintiffs and defense attorneys.
So answer that same question for me for the general public. What's the most important thing you'd like them to know about medical malpractice?
I think the most important thing is to ask questions. The best way to not be involved in a medical malpractice action is to be a good patient, to ask questions, not just go in there and listen and let people do things to you, walk out and then complain, to stop at that moment. If you're not getting good care, if your doctor is not applying himself to you, then stop them and ask them to go. Get second opinions, and then be honest. It's amazing to me the number of people aren't honest with their symptoms when they come in, either because of embarrassment or machismo or whatever it is. They don't come in and honestly talk about all of their circumstances, and then when they have a bad outcome, they're concerned about it. So be honest in your practice. I guess the gist of all these comments is to own your responsibility, to own your practice.
Now, New York attorney Michael Kaplan offers his perspective after practicing many years of brain injury law. His comments for healthcare providers I've never forgotten. Even though you can't see brain injuries, they're real. And his advice for all of us is the best way to cure a brain injury is prevention. These are two outstanding and memorable pieces of advice. What's the most important thing healthcare providers need to know about brain injury and medical malpractice?
Healthcare providers.
Yep.
They have to know that it is a real injury. They have to understand that you don't need to be knocked unconscious in order to have sustained a brain injury. They have to know that a CAT scan or an MRI study are just incapable of oftentimes finding that structural damage as a result of a brain injury because of the microscopic changes that take place, and the fact that these tests are normal doesn't preclude someone from having a brain injury. They have to understand, and this is really important, that individuals with a brain injury need to be treated with compassion and respect, because when they are talking about the problems and difficulties that they're having, even though you can't see them, they're real. So they shouldn't be disrespected in regard to the complaints that they're making to that physician. And that would be my most important advice to the medical profession.
Thank you for that. There's so much learning, I think, that needs to be done. There's so much new knowledge coming out but some really old knowledge, I think, to unlearn,
Yes.
and new ways of testing to come forward.
But I just want to leave one last thought on all of this. And this is pertinent to you guys in Canada, where you play a lot of hockey. Children play a lot of hockey, and also other sports, soccer, and we do the same thing in the U.S. as well as football and baseball and others, sporting activities. I like to say, when in doubt, keep them out. So when you have a child or an adult who has a suspected concussion, keep them out of play until they're properly medically cleared to return to play, because we don't want them to go back to play too soon before that first concussion heals. So we have to keep that as rule number one. When in doubt, keep them out.
Good advice, and you heard it here, folks. So listen, before we wrap up, I want you to answer that question too for lawyers. Let's talk about that. What would you like lawyers to know about brain injury and medical malpractice litigation?
What I'd like them to know is that not every client is right for every lawyer, and not every case is right for every lawyer, that there are a lot of nuances in brain injury litigation that is just not apparent to the average practitioner, even if they do personal injury work or medical malpractice. Law of brain injury is a very nuanced area, and they would be doing themselves and their clients a world of good if they associated with an attorney who really understood this complicated area.
What's the most important thing that you'd like the general public to know about brain injury and malpractice? You talked about the sports issue and keeping kids out if there's any question. But what else would you like to know the general public to know about brain injury and medical malpractice?
I'd like them to also know that the best cure for a brain injury is prevention. Mm-hmm. That there are many steps that can be taken around the house to prevent brain injuries from happening in young people and elderly people. That's important. That when you ride a bicycle or you engage in some other sports, that you go skiing, skate, you wear a helmet. Those are important steps to take. I'd like them to know that if they're not feeling right when it comes to medical issues, suffering from a headache that they've never suffered from before, the worst headache of their life, having headaches when they're not usually prone to headaches, having other neurological signs that they've never had in their life. If they think their loved one has had a stroke, that they get medical care right away, not to wait till the next day, not to brush it off, but get to an emergency department of a hospital and get evaluated right away. Because as we said earlier, time is brain. So that's the message I'd like to leave with the general public.
Now, one of the most memorable answers I got to the question of the most important thing we should all know about medical malpractice came from Alex Maldonovich, a plaintiff's lawyer from Toronto. Alex has been a military medic, a malpractice lawyer, and not so long ago, a patient with his own incredibly bumpy ride through the healthcare system. One comment that stuck with me from this episode was, question everything. You have the right to question. And if anyone says you don't have the right to question that too. Have a listen. What is the most important thing? And let's start with doctors and nurses. The most important thing that doctors and nurses need to know about medical malpractice.
That it's not a personal affront. That it's not personal. It's not personal, even though your name is on a lawsuit. That it is about fairness, justice, and a fair society, one in which, victims are compensated and made whole, and you'll get over it. You will get over this. You will walk away from this case, win, lose, or draw, and your life will likely not look much different. But this is my clients, this family's only shot at getting compensation that often has to carry them a very, very long time, and sometimes for the long haul. You and I do a lot of these obstetrical malpractice cases, and we see the kinds of challenges that families who are caring for babies with cerebral palsy or any kind of encephalopathy have in their marriage, in their life. And so the case is tremendously important to them. It's personal to them. But to the healthcare providers, I would just say, just swallow your pride once in a while. If you've made a mistake, face up to that. Acknowledge the things that you need to acknowledge. It's not an indictment. We all make mistakes. I do it too. We're not perfect human beings. We're flawed. We're going to make mistakes. But when you make a mistake, acknowledge it, and don't dig in your heels, and don't say things that don't make sense. Don't lie on the stand. Don't lie at your examination for discovery.
Right.
And just understand that this is about something beyond your ego or my ego or anyone else. It's just about these people who are trying to put together the pieces of a life that has been interrupted and sometimes ended.
I think maybe that's the best answer I've ever heard to that question. What is the most important thing that you'd like other lawyers to know about medical malpractice?
It's really hard. You shouldn't do it. Leave it to the professionals.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, and I say that in jest in part, but it is. I do see sort of a move now towards having more lawyers in this area. People who are advertising, at least as doing this work. I think you got to be really, really careful about the cases that you take on. Some of these cases are really, really complex. In fact, most medical malpractice cases, I don't know any really straightforward ones. They are all quite complicated. I've spent 20 plus years doing this work. I'm still learning. I'm interested in the medicine. That's what keeps me engaged in this. Not only, apart from, working with people who I want to help, it is an intellectually challenging and stimulating field, one that I consider myself lucky to be working in, but it's not something that you can dip your feet into. It's not the kind of law that you can practice while you're doing, your other state law or commercial litigation. It's more challenging than that. You really need to understand the complexities of this, particularly on the plaintiff side. The defense firms are well trained. The lawyers are well trained. They're usually brought up and trained from when they're pups right up until the point where they're doing trials. And I came through one of those firms myself. So I was very well trained there about how to defend doctors, which obviously has helped in my analysis of cases now as a plaintiff's lawyer. But that would be my advice. Don't take these cases on because you think that they're big or they're likely to pay out. They might be big, but they're, the chances of paying out are only as good as the arguments that you can make and the experts that you can bring to bear. The CMPA and HEROC, they're not here to just settle cases for the sake of settling it. They're sophisticated. They're very, very good lawyers. And so you need to know what you're doing in these cases. You can't fool around, and you can do real harm by not doing, a good job. I mean, if you take a case to an examination for discovery and you don't ask the right questions, you may have ruined any possibility of getting the admissions that you need to secure a trial victory or a settlement. And, some clients come to me after they've been with another firm and the discoveries have been done, and you take a look at the discoveries and you think, oh my goodness, no wonder they're not going to settle with you. Now you're going and you're flying in blind at a trial. You don't know what's going to come at you, and you haven't been able to secure those admissions. So
answer this question for the general public. What do they need to know? The most important thing the general public needs to know about medical malpractice?
It's more common than you think. It's more common than you think. In 2004, they came out with, Canadian Medical Journal came out with the adverse event study showing that there are upwards of 24,000 deaths annually in our hospitals from preventable adverse events. These are events not related to underlying illness. They are events directly flowing from healthcare. Some of these, 36%, which I think is an underestimation, is highly preventable, as the study's authors deemed it to be. And I think you need to question more. We have, all of us, a tendency to trust our doctors and to believe that we're getting the best care, and that when things go wrong, it may be somebody else's fault, but not your doctor's fault, or it might be your fault because you weren't doing something, or that just happens. And sometimes, and many times, that is the case. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Things happen in healthcare. There's no guarantee of a good outcome. But understand your health, understand what's being provided to you. And if you don't know, then call. There are good lawyers out there who can give you advice. Most of my clients who come to call, I tell them they probably don't have a case. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your money. But at least they have that answer, as opposed to wondering. And so that's what I would say. I would say, question everything. You have the right to question. And if anyone tells you that you don't have the right to question why they're telling you that too. It's your health, it's your life, and treat that with the respect that it deserves. And if you're not getting the right answers, then find someone who can give those to you. Find a good lawyer in your neighborhood, in your city, or your province, who can answer questions. And if they're caring and they're thoughtful and they know what they're doing, they will take the time to talk to you and tell you whether or not there is merit to your question or to your concern, or whether there isn't.
Thanks so much for listening into this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. There's so much for all of us to learn about medical malpractice. Tune in again next month for episode 2 of the best of Inside Medical Malpractice.